Hello, students. This is Professor McDermott. Um, the world should have been able to breathe a sigh of relief after that terrible conflict, World War II, ended. But such was not to be. As I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and on Nagasaki, Japan, ushered in the atomic age, and the threat of nuclear war hung over the world, and really still hangs over the world. We call, though, the period of tension that started in 1945 and lasted until 1991 the Cold War. During this period, there were two superpowers in the world, the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, also known as the Soviet Union. And the world became divided between a communist world and what Americans liked to call the free world. The reason it's called the Cold War is that the United States and the Soviets never actually went to war with each other. But there were times when this Cold War could become very hot, when allies or client states of the superpowers would go to war with the backing of the superpowers, as we will see. Now, really, it was Churchill, along with FDR, who set the stage for the creation or the expansion of the communist world after World War II. The Soviet army had pushed all the way to Berlin, and their troops were occupying large portions of Eastern Europe. And the Soviets had suffered so much during World War II, losing about 20 million of their citizens, that both Churchill and FDR essentially looked the other way as the Soviets established a power base in Eastern Europe. But in 1945, Churchill was actually voted out of office in what seems like an act of monumental ingratitude by the British people. And in retirement, he had time to reflect upon what had happened at the end of the war, and he began to have serious misgivings about the growth of the Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe. And so in 1946, President Truman invited Churchill to Westminster College in Truman's home state of Missouri to give a commencement speech. And Churchill gave his very famous speech known as the Iron Curtain speech. So I would ask you to go to the supplementary videos folder and watch the brief clip from Churchill's 1946 Iron Curtain speech, and then come back, please. Welcome back. Uh, so, what does Churchill mean when he speaks of the Iron Curtain? Well, the Soviets essentially, by 1949, had taken over the three Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They had installed puppet regimes in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And you see on the map the line then that separated the Soviet bloc from the rest of the world. And you notice also that that line splits Germany so that the Soviets also had a communist client regime in East Germany. So when Churchill speaks of the Iron Curtain, he's speaking of that red line dividing the communist world from the free world. But if you were listening carefully at the end of the speech, I think you get a sense of why immediately after World War II, the United States and Britain turned against their former allies, the Soviet Union, so powerfully. Churchill said that the war against Hitler could have been easily prevented if the Western democracies had stood up to Hitler's demands for more territory. And after World War II, Stalin, the Soviet dictator, came to seem like the new Hitler. And there was this idea that the free world should not appease Stalin the way it had appeased Hitler. And so in a sense, the Cold War was born out of that memory or that wish that something had been done to stop Hitler, and the desire to do something to stop any further communist expansion. But in 1949, the most populated country in the world went communist, namely China. I mentioned earlier there had been a long-standing revolution being fought by the communists in China under the leadership of Mao Zedong against the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, and they had called a truce during World War II to fight the Japanese together, but as soon as the war ended, they were back at each other's throats. But by 1949, the communists had emerged victorious and proclaimed the People's Republic of China. That is the government on mainland China that is still in existence today. Although they are still officially communist, of course, I'm sure you're aware they have adopted a capitalist free enterprise economy, which is now making them one of the world's powerhouses. So it will be interesting to see how this experiment of having a communist one-party dictatorship combined with free enterprise system works out in the long run. But when Chairman Mao and his followers won the revolution, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists escaped from mainland China, and they fled to an island off the coast of China called Taiwan. And there they proclaimed that they were the official, real Republic of China. And so for many years, the Taiwanese were actually our main allies in Southeast Asia. And when I was a kid in the 70s, everything you bought said made in Taiwan. Now, of course, it says made in China because we've turned our back somewhat on the Taiwanese and we've really embraced communist China as a trading partner. But for a long time, the Taiwanese claimed to be the official Chinese government, and they were our allies. Now, one of the key events that helped to determine our policy towards China happened in February 1946, and it had to do with a diplomat, George Kennan, an American diplomat stationed in Moscow. One night, Kennan typed out a very, very long telegram. In fact, it's just known as the Long Telegram, that he sent back to the State Department in Washington, setting out his vision of the aims of the Soviets and what our policy should be. Basically, Kennan said that the Soviets wanted world domination. They would stop at nothing short of total destruction of the free world and communist revolution throughout the world. And so it was impossible, according to Kennan, for us to really reason with the Soviets or compromise with them. We had to stop them from any further expansion. And the program that Kennan proposed for this he called containment. In other words, our goal became to contain the Soviets where they were and to prevent communism from expanding to any more countries. And there were various ways that we tried to contain the Soviets. The Truman Doctrine, which President Truman announced in March 1947, said, very much in keeping with Kennan's logic, that the United States should, quote, support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. In other words, if there was any free country in the world that looked like it might be overthrown in a communist revolution or taken over by the Soviets from outside, we should give them support. And sometimes we did this by giving them weapons or military support. More often, we promoted containment by giving other countries money, large amounts of foreign aid, American technology, weapons, but also things like tractors and refrigerators and microwave ovens and radar systems and so forth, to win them over to our side. And we could afford to do that because our economy was the #1 economy in the world at the time. And so during this entire period of the Cold War, we lavished foreign aid on Europe and also on Asia and Africa and the rest of the world trying to win them over so that they would be our friends during the Cold War so that they would not go communist. Now, I want to talk about Germany. Germany was a special case in the Cold War. The nation of Germany was divided into two halves. East Germany, or the GDR, German Democratic Republic, was behind the Iron Curtain. West Germany was part of the free world. It was officially called the German Federal Republic. I want to show you on the map here, though. There was a strange exception to this rule. Even though all of East Germany was behind the Iron Curtain, notice the capital city of Berlin was actually divided into a communist zone, East Berlin, and an American-dominated zone, West Berlin. So the city of West Berlin was like a tiny oasis of Western democracy, totally surrounded by a hardline communist regime, the GDR. And so this strange anomaly would become a real flashpoint for tensions during the Cold War. And that first happened in 1948. Now, Hitler had built a superhighway across Germany called the Autobahn, which is still there. In fact, it's famous for not having any speed limit. But Stalin in 1848 decided to cut off the Autobahn for traffic from West Germany into East Germany and into West Berlin. And most of the supplies that had been coming into West Berlin came over that highway. And so essentially Stalin was trying to starve out the West Berliners and to take over West Berlin for communist East Germany. Truman's response was to deploy aircraft to have the Air Force land several planes every day in West Berlin, carrying food and other essential supplies so that West Berlin could remain part of the free world. We call this the Berlin Airlift, and this went on every day for several months into 1949 before Stalin finally realized that Truman meant business and gave up and allowed West Berlin, to continue its existence as part of the free world throughout the Cold War period. But it would continue to be a spot of great tension, as we'll see, during the Cold War. Now, the atomic age started primarily because of the revenge, you could say, of Jewish refugee scientists who had fled from Nazi Germany, from Hitler's tyranny. Men like Albert Einstein, who was the first one to broach the possibility of using the awesome power of nuclear fission to construct a super weapon. And it's not hard to understand why these Jewish refugees would volunteer their services to the U.S. government and take part in the Manhattan Project, which was the project to build the first atomic bomb. They really had a strong interest in seeing that the U.S. got the atom bomb before Hitler did. And as it turned out, we did beat Hitler to that, and it was what enabled us to win the war in the Pacific. However, the Soviet Union also developed its own atomic bomb and had successfully tested it by 1949. So that was really a blow at our security, since we were no longer the only nuclear power. However, the United States took another great leap forward in terms of the atomic age in November of 1952, when we tested our new super weapon. This was called a hydrogen bomb, or a thermonuclear device, and instead of operating on nuclear fission, it was powered by nuclear fusion, and as a result was 1,000 times more powerful than the A-bomb that we had dropped on Hiroshima. And so, to demonstrate the awesome superiority of this weapon to the rest of the world, we tested this bomb, which was called Ivy Mike, on November the 1st, 1952. We owned a set of islands in the South Pacific called the Eniwetok Atoll. And so we cleared off all the people and moved them far away in the Pacific. And then on the island of Alujilab, we detonated Ivy Mike. And a Hollywood camera crew was there to record the test. And the recording was shown on television in America. And I want you to go to the supplementary videos folder and watch this footage of the test of the Ivy Mike H-bomb, and then come back. Wow. What did you think of that? Just imagine you're watching TV. It's 1952. You're getting ready to watch Leave It to Beaver or whatever your favorite show is, and that comes on the screen. A whole gamut of emotions, I think, are possible. You might feel proud and elated that the United States had this new magnificent weapon. You might have been impressed with the scientific genius that went into it. Or perhaps you might simply feel scared that the world could be subject to devastation from such an incredibly powerful weapon. And especially you might feel that after the Soviets fairly quickly were able to get their own H-bomb. And so the H-bomb really ratcheted up the stakes for humanity, especially as the Cold War continued to escalate. Essentially, the United States was committed to keeping any country in the world from going communist. And the theory behind this was called the domino theory, and it has to do with a game you may have played when you were little kids. If you had a set of dominoes and you set one up right next to the other, standing upright, and then in a row, and then you push the first one down, what happens? Well, all the rest of them come tumbling down, of course. Well, the theory was that if we allowed even one country in the world to go communist, that then all the countries around it in its region would go communist, and then pretty soon all the dominoes would come crashing down and the entire world would be communist. And so we were determined to prevent even one more country from going communist, and that was what gave rise to the wars in Korea and Vietnam. And we also relied on our nuclear threat, however, to prevent us from a full-scale war with the Soviet Union. Even though we were having these little minor proxy wars around the globe with the communists, the idea was that if we built up our arsenal of nuclear weapons, so that the Soviets knew that their entire civilization might face serious catastrophe if a war started, that we would then never have to go to war with the Soviets. This was called deterrence, the idea that having a lot of nuclear weapons would deter either side from declaring war, either the Soviets or the US. And as time went on and as more and more H-bombs were built, the theory of deterrence evolved into what was called MAD, mutually assured destruction. In other words, we reached the point where each side had enough atomic weapons to annihilate human life on this earth if a nuclear war ever started. Mutually assured destruction. And again, this was somewhat part of the plan. The idea was that neither side would be that crazy to start a war, knowing that it would result in the annihilation of human civilization. And it should be said that perhaps this worked, even though it seems somewhat barbaric or like playing Russian roulette. It is true that throughout the entire period of the Cold War, the US and the USSR never actually went to war. Those two countries never actually declared war on each other, so perhaps it was effective. Nevertheless, the threat of nuclear war really took a psychological toll on all the inhabitants of the earth. As the great American novelist from Mississippi, William Faulkner, pointed out when he accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1950, he said, "Our tragedy today is a general and universal physical fear, so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up?" End quote. And I remember that feeling, or that question. Growing up as a child during the Cold War era, I was scared. There were movies on TV about what would happen in the aftermath of a nuclear holocaust. We had nuclear war drills in school, believe it or not, ineffective though those were. And I remember asking that question to myself, when will we all be blown up? And that was a terrifying reality. Now, when the Cold War ended, I think a lot of people just dismissed that question. Oh, what a relief. Now we don't have to worry about this anymore. But I do want to say that we should still be worried about this, because after all, there are a lot of nuclear weapons in the world. The United States has them, the Russians have them, China has them, France has them, Britain, Israel, India, Pakistan, the North Koreans now have them, Iran may have them very soon. And this is really something still to think about. I don't want to scare you to death, but something that you as informed citizens should be aware of, that the threat of nuclear war did not disappear with the end of the Cold War. But it certainly is true that during the Cold War, people were often on high alert, and there was a great deal of anxiety caused by this fear of atomic war. Well, one of the achievements of the post-war era was the creation of the United Nations. Unlike the League of Nations, the United Nations had the full support of the United States government. In fact, it was during World War II in San Francisco that the UN Charter was initially drafted. I just want to mention a little bit about the structure of governance of the United Nations. So basically every nation that belongs to the UN has representation in what's called the General Assembly. And any nation can propose a motion in the General Assembly and have it voted on by all of the member nations. However, the real power in the UN belongs to a smaller group of nations called the Security Council. Some nations rotate on and off the Security Council, but there are 5 nations that are permanently members of the Security Council. And those nations, at the time the UN was created, were the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, France, and China. Now, nowadays, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, so Russia has the Soviet seat. And China, before 1971, after the Communist Revolution, but before 1971, the Chinese seat was held by Taiwan, but in 1971, the Nixon administration allowed the representation to go to the People's Republic. So now the 5 permanent members are the US, Great Britain, Russia, France, and the People's Republic of China. Now, what makes these nations so powerful is that any resolution passed by the General Assembly can be vetoed by any member of the Security Council. And so, essentially, these nations get to control what the United Nations can do. And they use this veto power extensively. For example, as I speak this in 2016, very recently, a motion was proposed to stop the Russians and the Syrian government from bombing innocent Syrian civilians in the city of Aleppo. But of course, Russia stepped in and vetoed that resolution, so the UN could do nothing about it. Of course, to be fair, the US has also vetoed many resolutions in its time. I want to mention one of the greatest achievements of the UN during its early years was the production of a statement called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the guiding spirit behind that document was none other than former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who was part of our diplomatic team at the UN And she took over the drafting committee for this document and really made it happen. So it was a great achievement for Eleanor Roosevelt in 1948. Now, I want to talk about the first of the major proxy wars between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and that took place in Korea beginning in 1950. So, before World War II, Korea had been controlled for a number of years by Japan. After the war, it was divided in half, and the northern part was essentially controlled by the Soviet Union, became North Korea, and the southern part was controlled by the United States and became South Korea. So, of course, the northern part had a communist regime, and in fact, it still does under its wacky dictator Kim Jong-un, perhaps the most hardline communist country still in existence in the world. But in June 1950, the communists in North Korea decided to attack South Korea and to make the entire Korean peninsula communist. And their invasion was very successful. They captured the capital city, Seoul, and pushed the South Koreans back almost into the sea. Now, the United States decided to go to the United Nations for support in helping our ally, South Korea. And what we requested was that the United Nations pass a resolution calling for a coalition of UN countries to send troops for a quote-unquote police action in Korea to drive back the North Korean aggression. And of course, you would expect the Soviets to veto that resolution, but it just so happened that they were boycotting the UN at that moment because the People's Republic of China had not been given the Chinese seat on the Security Council. So they had taken their ball and gone home. So they were not around to veto the police action resolution that started the Korean War. And so the UN did send a multinational coalition of troops, but most of the troops were American, and they were commanded by one of our greatest generals, Douglas MacArthur. And I'll show you on the map here. MacArthur landed his troops at a place called Incheon on the west coast of Korea, and very successfully drove northward while other troops pushed forward from the southernmost part of Korea. And MacArthur very successfully drove the North Koreans all the way back to the Chinese border. But then MacArthur, who was very outspoken, let his mouth get the best of him, and he let it be known that he thought it would be a good idea to drop nuclear weapons on China and to go ahead and invade China and take it back for the free world. So at this point, the Chinese began to get very scared, having this large, mostly American force on their border, talking about invasion and nuclear war, and they sent an enormous invading force into Korea that pushed our troops back again halfway down the peninsula. Meanwhile, MacArthur had been fired by Truman for disobedience because of his continuous questioning of Truman's decisions and Truman's desire to negotiate a solution with the Chinese. And so he was relieved from command, but no other American commander was nearly as successful as MacArthur. The war settled down into a very bloody stalemate. And ultimately, what happened was that a line was drawn. You see it there on the map, the truce line. Truce was declared in 1953. There was never an actual peace treaty for this war, so technically North and South Korea are still at war, and there still is a lot of tension between those two countries. But that was the line that was drawn between North and South Korea when the hostilities ended in 1953. So this was the first of the proxy wars between the communist world and the free world. We'll encounter some more of those later. But I want to go to A slightly different but related topic, decolonization. What is that? Well, we talked about imperialism and how during the 19th century European powers had colonized large portions of Asia and of Africa. After World War II, though, these European empires began to dissolve, and those former colonies began to develop into nation states in their own right. Taking the lead in this process was the nation of India under the inspired leadership of Mohandas K. Gandhi, better known as Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma is a title, it just means great soul. Great soul. Now, who was Gandhi? He was an attorney by trade, but he was also a deeply spiritual man. He was a student of religion, and he developed his own personal religious philosophy based on Hinduism, but also Christianity and Islam as well. And when Gandhi studied those religions, what he found that they all had in common was the idea of sacrifice. In other words, the willingness to sacrifice oneself for the greater good of all. And so Gandhi set out to channel this will to sacrifice oneself in a constructive direction to liberate India. His idea was that if people would disobey unjust laws nonviolently, and if they would be willing to suffer the consequences, this would release tremendous soul force, satyagraha, soul force within India. The power of love would overcome hate, and India would be liberated. Now, needless to say, this way of thinking was very, very influential on the American civil rights movement, including the ideas of Dr. Martin Luther King. And he and other civil rights leaders did put Gandhi's ideas into practice in this country. In India, Gandhi used these tactics, for example, to create boycotts of British clothing, textile goods, of British manufactured salt, and to carry out different kinds of nonviolent demonstrations for which he was frequently thrown in jail. But gradually over time, the power of this nonviolent movement wore away at the British Empire, and by 1946, the British had decided it was not worth it to hang on to this Indian colony, and so they announced that they would shortly be leaving the Indian subcontinent. And what happened next would be repeated in nearly all of these situations of decolonization. Essentially, there was no good exit strategy, and once the colonizing powers left, tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface but that had been kept under control by the colonizing powers' armies exploded. And that was the case in India, because as soon as the British pulled out without, really a very good plan, and immediately a civil war broke out between the Hindus and Muslims in India, in which literally millions of people were killed in the most horrifying ways. This was a national tragedy. Gandhi, of course, was absolutely horrified by this. At one point, he went on a hunger strike to try to get people to stop the violence, but then Gandhi himself became the victim of this violent surge when a Hindu fanatic who accused him of being too friendly to Muslims assassinated Gandhi in 1948. And so ultimately, the terrible conflict between Hindus and Muslims was only resolved by the creation of the separate Muslim nation of Pakistan, East and West Pakistan. East Pakistan is now known as Bangladesh. But those are Muslim, that's where Muslim Indians live, and the nation of India itself is predominantly Hindu. But we'll see this terrible outbreak of violence, civil war, and so forth attending upon a lot of these decolonization efforts. Looking at this map of Southeast Asia, this shows the years in which different nations became independent of their former colonizers. You see India, Pakistan there. The British also let go of Burma. You see that the United States let the Philippines go in 1946 to set a good example for the European powers. Very significantly, though, if you take a look at the red area, the nations, what are now the nations of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. This area had been colonized by France, but a communist resistance movement in Vietnam under the leadership of a man named Ho Chi Minh had been fighting the French for some time, and in 1954 Ho Chi Minh's communist rebels won a huge smashing victory over the French in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and this encouraged the French and convinced them to pull out of their Southeast Asian colonies. Well, guess who got left holding the bag and trying to prevent Vietnam, especially from going communist? The United States, of course, based on the domino theory. We believed that if Vietnam went communist, then pretty soon Thailand and Burma and Cambodia, all those other nations would be communist too, and we couldn't let that happen. So what wound up occurring in Vietnam was similar to the situation in Korea. A North Vietnam was created under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, a communist nation, but South Vietnam, for a time, remained part of the free world with extensive support from the United States. But really, the struggle to keep South Vietnam in existence led to the Vietnam War, which really lasted for about 20 years, from 1955 to 1975. The U.S. didn't begin sending in ground troops until 1964, 65. So really, we date the U.S. involvement officially 1965 to 1973, 8 years, but really, this war lasted for 20 years, and the U.S. was involved from beginning to end, trying to keep South Vietnam from going communist, but of course having massive consequences and creating a lot of unrest within our own country. All right, what about the Middle East? After World War I, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the British had taken over Palestine, the Holy Land, and large portions of the Middle East. But, of course, Jewish refugees had been filtering in to Palestine even before World War II. And after World War II, of course, there was tremendous sympathy for what the Jews had suffered under Hitler, and an idea that perhaps they should be allowed to go back to their biblical homeland. But so more and more Jewish settlers began to come into Palestine, hoping to create a Jewish state there. However, the British still hung on until, actually, it's quite interesting, Jewish terrorism ultimately helped convince them to leave. Now, of course, the problem in today's world is more Arab terrorism, but there were Jewish terrorist groups that were fighting guerrilla war to get the Jewish state. For example, the British headquarters in Israel, the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, was bombed brutally by Jewish terrorists. And so Palestine eventually became too hot for the British to handle, and so they pulled out. At that point, the United Nations got involved. And the UN passed a resolution, number 181, which called for a two-state solution. Because, of course, as these Jewish settlers migrated into Palestine, there were already Arabs living there who had been there for thousands of years and who considered it their homeland. So the question was what to do about the Palestinians who were already there. Well, the United Nations proposed that two states be set up, a Jewish state in this map in white and an Arab state in gold. And to the Jews' credit, they actually accepted this plan, but the Arabs rejected it, and a war erupted when the Arabs began to attack the Jewish settlements. However, the Jewish settlers won this war very handily, and in 1948 declared the existence of the new state of Israel. But of course, this is another example of how we are still dealing with the problems caused by colonial empires and decolonization, because needless to say, this problem is still going on. There is no solution in sight, and Israel and Palestine continue to be flashpoints of violence and terrorism and so forth in a very scary way in the modern world. Another important moment in Middle Eastern decolonization took place in 1956. Now, it's slightly off this map, but the French and the British, you will recall, had built a canal between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and then the British had taken it over entirely. And so in 1956, the British were administering the Suez Canal, but the new independent government of Egypt under President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced in 1956 that they were taking over the canal. It was going to be administered for the people of Egypt, and that the British had to leave. Well, at this point, the British and the French got together, and they convinced the Israelis to invade the canal zone so that the British and the French could come in and quote-unquote restore order. This was a very clever trick, and the plan was executed. But it all fell through because the British and French, had been counting on American support. After all, the United States was their closest ally, and they were also members of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the anti-communist group that was founded after World War II and is still in existence. But the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, shocked them and shocked the world by absolutely categorically refusing to support the British, by saying that the British should pull out of the canal zone, they should let Egypt have it. And the reason why this was so significant was that essentially the U.S. was signaling that they were not going to do anything in the future to help European powers keep their colonial empires. So, in fact, the British had to pull out of the canal zone. It became Egyptian. And this event, the Suez Crisis of 1956, really accelerated the pace of decolonization, and really made it a foregone conclusion that these colonial empires would eventually all disappear. One final note with reference to the Middle East. The British had installed royal family in Iraq as a sort of puppet regime, very friendly to them. But in 1958, their client, King Faisal II, was assassinated, and this led to this started the long process by which the Ba'ath Party under Saddam Hussein eventually took power and established a dictatorship, leading to the First and Second Persian Gulf Wars. So here you see once again the United States, in a sense, having to come in and mop up the problems caused by rapid or poorly planned decolonization. Now, one of the reasons why Eisenhower had made it clear he was not going to support colonial empires was that it was really in the Americans' best interest to have these countries in Africa and Asia be independent. That way, we could come in ourselves and we could win these countries over to become our allies with the promise of money and gifts and food and other goodies and so forth. And so as I mentioned, this was our main strategy in terms of winning the Cold War, containing communism, by winning people over to our team, by giving them stuff. This policy really started in Europe immediately after the war, in what was called the Marshall Plan, when we gave billions of dollars, even to Germany. In fact, not only did Germany not pay the U.S. any reparations after World War II, we, in a sense, paid Germany because it was the United States that went into Germany and rebuilt that country with our taxpayer dollars, making it into the industrial powerhouse that it is once again today. So, but that all of that was done very deliberately to keep West Germany and the rest of Western Europe from going communist. But the Soviets were doing the same thing, and third world nations would sometimes play the U.S. aid off against the Soviet aid to see who they could get to give them the most stuff. And sometimes this competition to win over these countries would erupt in violence. For example, in the Southwest African nation of Angola, which formerly had been owned by the Portuguese, a civil war took place between 1975 and 1991. 16 years this went on between military groups that were financed by the Soviets and by the United States. And a very bloody civil war cost untold numbers of lives. So again, as I said before, an example of how the Cold War could become very hot. In Africa, too, you see numerous examples of failures of decolonization. As European powers just disappeared seemingly overnight without coming up with any plan for the transition. For example, in the Congo, the scene of that hateful regime created by King Leopold II of Belgium. Well, the Belgians finally pulled out of the Congo in 1960. But this was very sudden, very poorly planned, and so it resulted in a civil war in the Congo that really has gone on off and on until the present day. In 1965, the British colony of Rhodesia became independent, and for a number of years, this was a white supremacist state, somewhat like South Africa used to be. But a revolution took place, and now Rhodesia is known as Zimbabwe, and it's a black supremacist state with a dictator named Robert Mugabe, who is just as tyrannical and repressive as the old white supremacist regime of Rhodesia was. And so you often see these African nations going to extremes of tyranny on either side, and really still looking for stability and peace and prosperity. And so again, the aftermath of these colonial empires really has been very troubled, very traumatic for many of the areas and peoples of the world. Well, in 1953, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin died, and his successor, as the power struggle in the Kremlin, that is the Soviet headquarters in Moscow, took place over a few years, the power struggle was won by a very different figure, a man named Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev took a different approach, and he signaled that he was going to take a different approach in 1956 when he got up and made a famous speech at the 20th Communist Party Congress, in which he attacked Stalin as essentially a war criminal, accused him of crimes against humanity, all the things we talked about already, massacring millions of his citizens, sending them off to prison camps, political prisoners, and so forth, and charging Stalin with creating a cult of personality around himself that really worked against true communist thinking. And so with this speech, Khrushchev signaled the opening of the period known as the Thaw, during which Khrushchev did allow somewhat more freedom of speech in the Soviet Union. Authors were allowed to publish their works a little more freely. Fewer people were sent to the gulags in Siberia. However, this thaw really only went so far, as Khrushchev showed in 1956, when the Hungarians staged a revolt against their Soviet puppet masters, and Khrushchev, of course, immediately sent in the tanks to Budapest and crushed this Hungarian Revolution very brutally. So Khrushchev may have been a kinder, gentler dictator than Stalin, but he wasn't about to let the Soviets lose their empire, the Soviet sphere. Meanwhile, in East Germany, West Berlin essentially provided an escape hatch for people from East Germany and the communist world who wanted to get out of the communist system, especially as more and more people were affected by communist economic policies, the creation of collective farms, the chronic shortages of basic supplies like food and toilet paper and gas and cars and so forth. Communists, many of them, or people in the communist world, fled to the Western world through West Berlin. If they could get to West Berlin, they could often get out through to West Germany and find refuge in the free world. And this was causing a serious problem for East Germany especially. It was a brain drain. They were losing a lot of their population. And so one night in 1961, with the permission of the Kremlin, the East Germans built a wall around the city of West Berlin overnight. Now, I'm not saying it was finished overnight, but the groundwork was laid for this entire 96-mile wall, which totally surrounded West Berlin in one night. So when the citizens of Berlin woke up the next morning, they found they were cut off from each other, East and West Berlin. And this was a real hardship for many families. For example, there were some families where members of the family were visiting friends in East Berlin, let's say, or in West Berlin, and they were cut off from each other for many years, accidentally, as a result of this. So really, the Berlin Wall was very, very symbolic of this painful divide between the free world and the communist world, and it stood as a very, very potent symbol of the Cold War for many, many years. But perhaps the most dangerous flashpoint of the entire Cold War became Cuba in the early 1960s. Now, after the Spanish-American War of 1898, the United States had created a friendly pro-American regime in Cuba. But in 1959, this regime was overthrown by a communist revolutionary named Fidel Castro, who for many years was the dictator of Cuba. Now, as I speak in 2016, his brother Raul has taken over. Cuba is still communist. And in the early 1960s, Fidel allowed the Soviets to begin building launching sites in preparation for installing nuclear missiles on Cuba that would be pointed at American cities. And it was one of our spy planes flying over Cuba that detected these installations and alerted the president, John F. Kennedy. And so Kennedy went before the nation and announced that he was blockading Cuba. Of course, he couldn't allow these missiles to be installed 90 miles from Miami, Florida. And so the U.S. basically drew a line, a circle around Cuba, and prevented any ships from crossing this line for several days to try to prevent the Soviets from bringing in their missiles. And the world went into a state of great tension in which many people believed that World War III and nuclear annihilation was imminent. I remember both my parents told me they were scared to death. They were sure that the world was coming to an end during this Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. However, JFK held firm, and Khrushchev ultimately was the first to blink. He gave in and agreed to take the missiles out of Cuba. Kennedy, this is not widely known, but Kennedy also made a concession. We removed some missiles out from Turkey and Italy, which we already had pointed at the Soviet Union, by the way. And so secretly JFK agreed to take those missiles out if the Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. So the world breathed a sigh of relief, but had never really come as close to nuclear war as it did for those few days in October 1962. we'll give President Kennedy the last word on the Cold War. Um, in June of 1963, Kennedy went to West Berlin, and in front of the Berlin Wall, he gave his famous Berlin Wall speech, in which he repeated the phrase, Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a Berliner. I am a citizen of Berlin. And so this will be the next video in the supplementary videos folder. So as I say goodbye to you this time, I'll let you go and linger with Kennedy's words in one of the greatest of all pieces of American Cold War rhetoric.